Whitley Strieber, you listen to all this talk of astronauts going out and visiting the moon even and coming back, and you have had a different set of experiences.
Well, recently, yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, first, I would like to talk just briefly about media hype and so forth. I was introduced as a person who has been diddled with by little men, aliens. I have never made any such claim, and in fact have written a couple of books about it, and then spent years, until I was almost blue in the face, trying to communicate what I actually said, and failing, completely failing, to the point where there's no real purpose in going on with it any further. I failed utterly to communicate what I was really trying to write about. I had a series, and have had on an ongoing basis, of a series of extremely unusual perceptions. I think that it's fair to characterize them as such, because they are indistinguishable on the one hand from physical experiences. On the other hand, they are indistinguishable from dreams. And on the third, and they appropriately have three hands, they could not possibly have happened, and yet they seem to have happened. And not only that, I've been able to induce them in large groups of people simultaneously.
You think you'd pass that?
I think you're having your cake and eating it. I mean, I've reread Communion, in fact, last night, and it wasn't marketed as a work of fiction. It was top of the non-fiction.
I'm not suggesting that there was any fiction involved in it at all.
Set the scene for us a little longer.
So tell us now, what are you saying? The question I'd like to ask, in some of the very strange experiences that you describe, where small beings probed, intimately probed you in some cases, and apparently put ideas into your head. What I'd like to know, when you perceived those creatures, in your best judgment, if a video camera had been running at that time, would the video camera have shown those creatures?
I don't know the answer to that question, and that is my best judgment. And that's exactly where I've stood with it from the very beginning. In Communion, I said that when we face the unknown, really face the unknown, the human mind, I think the phrase was, winks back from the dark. And that was the central theme of the book. And yet the central theme of the book was instead taken to be a visitation by aliens, and the issue was whether or not I was to be believed.
But with respect, your wife seems to know. On page 197 of the book, she's quoted as saying that you see things that she doesn't see. She knows that some of the things that you saw in the book were not observable by other people. So there, in specific instances, you know those things weren't real.
And yet
but you wrote about them as though they maybe were real. You kind of...
No, I wrote about the experience. I described the texture of the experience very accurately. And I did that for this reason. Thousands of people have the experience. I discovered that before I wrote the book. And every one of those people, once a person has this experience, they become a kind of a revolutionary.
Can you help us with what the
experience is?
What the experience is, because Stephen has had the advantage of reading this book. Yes. Maybe others will not. Please take it from the beginning, and then you have the whole. You have the floor.
Essentially, what the experience was this: I was awakened out of a dead sleep in the middle of the night of December the 26th, 1985, by a strange sound downstairs in my house. I sat up in bed, and these small, quick-moving figures came rushing into the room, and I found myself being carried out a few minutes later in a state of what I would describe as extreme agitation and fear.
I think you have to add that a lot of this information came from regression hypnosis.
No, I'm not describing anything that... I won't yet describe anything that came from hypnosis.
It wasn't regression hypnosis. It didn't happen in past lives. But
I wish, well, anyway, let me finish. I found myself sitting in my woods in a little circle where the snow had been cleared away, with these strange figures that were goblin-like at once and elfin. And a moment later, I shot up into the air. There was a sort of flash of something which under hypnosis became the trees going past my face. And I found myself in a little tiny room where I was assaulted by these strange things, all the while trying to wake up, because I was, even while this was happening, my assumption was that I was dreaming. Afterwards, I was so traumatized by what happened to me that I eventually went to the doctor. And about 2 weeks, a week and a half later, and in some ways, unfortunately, looked up a UFO expert and found him to be completely convinced that I had had an experience with aliens. But the experience was so terrible that I did not wish to believe that. I must admit that I came to it with very little previous knowledge of the whole subject. I hadn't thought about UFOs since I was about 12.
You had a book by Jenny Randall's
that had been given to me
according to your own writings.
given to me for Christmas.
And you neglect to say that from, again, according to your own writings, that you'd had similar experiences from age 12 when you had a similar
experience. But that only came out under hypnosis. I wasn't aware of that when this happened. It was as if it came out. And in fact, I hope we don't turn out to have an adversarial conversation, not because of the fact that I don't welcome it, but because it's terribly boring. And I'll tell you why it's boring in a minute. I have been trying to ask a question. I asked it privately, and I was unsuccessful in getting an answer. The question is, what happened to me? An answer to that question certainly is not, nothing happened to you, you fool, get out of here. In truth, I think I can probably prove that something unknown is happening. And in fact, in the past couple of years, I've had a lot of people come to my cabin, including reporters, a documentary film crew, scientists, many of whom have had, in fact, most of whom have had pretty bizarre experiences there, and in groups, not in isolation as I did.
No, but you're also helping to perhaps convince people who have had strange dreams, and we all have strange dreams at one time or another. Hypnopompic type of illusions fit very much the kind of description that you come up with.
No, they don't.
Okay, when I was a young kid, I used to suffer from, I had all the childhood illnesses, and following that, used to get delirious with fever. And some of the imagery you describe is very similar to that.
I agree with you,
now, the point I would make, that by giving the impression that there's some reality to this, I suspect that you're convincing a lot of people who are just having bad dreams that they have had an experience with weird creatures, and you're putting fear into these people. I think you've done damage with that book. As well as making a lot of money out of it, of course.
Can I ask just one sort of factual question? These weird creatures, they presumably, they were what? They had 2 arms, 2 legs?
Yes.
And
they weren't so weird as one of the cliches that I've been visited with is that if they were really aliens, they would be extremely strange looking, far stranger looking than what you perceived. And I would agree that might very well be true. However, there are also other things that I find difficult to explain. I had a needle mark on the side of my head. And later, when I received an MRI scan, there's also a mark in my brain at that point. Why?
Well, stigmata. You seem to be
yes, exactly.
claiming mainly now that you're
stigmata.
experiencing an extremely strange, altered state of consciousness, in fact.
But it's a rather common one.
Well, how many % of the population?
I don't know, because there's no way to tell. The social opprobrium associated with it is so great that people won't speak about it generally.
Well, I mean, I'm a science fiction writer, and nobody has ever come up to me and said that I have had such an experience. This is possibly because the sort of people who go to science fiction conventions tend to be super rationalists.
Exactly, that is why. Science fiction...
You mentioned earlier, though, that you're able to induce this experience in other people. What did you mean by that? Did you mean hypnotically, or...?
No, absolutely not.
What,
I'll give you an
talking
example.
To them? Does it happen in front of you? I mean, that's what I'm interested in.
Well, may I tell you, describe one of these experiences? I had, a year ago, April, I had 9 people up to my cabin in upstate New York, including 2 reporters. One, a man who writes for various American magazines like Esquire, so forth, you may or may not have heard of. The other, a newspaper man. And the night that they were there, the following incident occurred. The reporter was sleeping in the living room in a cot with 2 other people present in the room, the magazine reporter. The newspaper reporter was in a bedroom in the basement. There were other people throughout the house. The house was filled with people. It's a small house. In the middle of the night, when the people in the living room were sort of half asleep, no one was sleeping very heavily. Suddenly, the front door flew open. All 3 people found themselves simultaneously paralyzed. As soon as they heard the noise, they began to move and found they could not move. These little figures moved around in the room, eventually lifted the reporter's bed up off the floor a few times and left.
Where's this detailed? Is it detailed by the reporter in Esquire?
Well, no, after it happened, he refused, he became frightened. He said it would ruin his career to write about it. He had gone up there to write something else. But the other people in the room and the reporter were willing to write, the 2 other people in the room are willing to be identified, and the reporter has made a sworn statement, although he will not let his name out.
Well, because this is the kind of anecdotal information that I come across all the time in the skeptics movement, for fairies, for ghosts.
We don't have his name for the record.
No,
today.
you don't have his name for the record.
And you won't give it up?
I can't. Okay. I wish I could.
What you need to be able to do is induce this kind of event. If you were actually inducing, you said earlier you were inducing it, you weren't actually. It happened because...
well, I don't
vicinity.
agree with you. I think it was induced by the situation and the expectations of the people who were there. I'm not at all sure that it
intentionally that you did.
Well, of course, I brought them there.
Oh, well, it happened in your vicinity. Yeah, but you didn't induce it in them.
I induced it. I suspect that I did induce it in them by writing the book and bringing them to the cabin. I think I did induce it in them. I think, in a sense, that was my mistake in writing the book. If it was a mistake, and I'm not at all sure that it was.
It can't have been financially, can it?
I mean,
as a writer, this is far and away your most successful work. I mean, let's be cynical a moment. That people like Charles Berlitz, Eric von Daniken, in a very different way, have been very successful by writing about the unknown.
What have they done with their money?
I've no idea. That isn't the question I'm addressing.
But it's an important question, isn't it?
But your success as a writer, I guess, in terms of number of books sold or numbers of millions of dollars made, went up drastically when you published...
No, that's not true. My first book, The Wolfen, sold more in paperback than Communion did.
Yeah,
well,
no,
certainly wasn't.
Advance
you got I believe you got $1 million advance on Communion.
My previous largest advance had been $750,000, and this one was $1 million. It's true.
Was $1 million.
Somewhat
okay,
larger.
So even if it didn't greatly up it, it certainly wasn't a mistake in financial terms.
But one of the things
to sell this book as a work of non-fiction, whatever that means, you didn't sell it as a work of imagination. You didn't sell it as a work of fiction. It went out as a work of non-fiction.
Which is what it is.
Now, I still don't know what you mean by that, what the reality you think lies behind the book is. I still don't understand.
In other words, as far as you can understand it, I don't quite know your definition of reality. Seems to be sort of askew.
Sure, no, I don't understand what you're claiming to say in the book. I haven't understood by reading it, and I haven't understood
I'm asking a question, but people from the skeptics community always say, claiming this, you're claiming that.
No, I'm asking you...
And I'm not claiming anything.
Well, I'm asking you what you're saying in the book about the reality or otherwise.
I am asking a question in the book. The question is what happened to me. And as far as where my money went, last year, a considerable amount of it went to a foundation I created called the Communion Foundation, which is only funded by me and is specifically intended to receive funds from what I would think is an excessive amount of money I've received from these books, and it is truly huge.
But isn't one possibility simply that, like a lot of other people who are fantasy prone, which I think is a categorization that psychologists use,
but the psychological tests I've taken don't show that don't indicate any at all that I have a fantasy-prone personality.
I think you've got to distinguish between two things there. I mean, one thing is that he may have gone during a state of stress through a kind of quasi-religious conversion.
Exactly.
The other thing which is being suggested is that you're irresponsible for making $1 million out of this, which no other UFO book has done.
No,
but your particular quasi-religious conversion is connected with the contemporary folklore of flying saucers and visitors.
I'm saying he's doing harm psychologically to people who perhaps do have problem. Okay, you're not fantasy prone, but I think 3-4% of the population are.
Yes.
And have very vivid, very realistic dreams, perhaps of different types, but perhaps of a menacing nature.
But
and I think a
what is-
number of these people now are going to be fearful, and are fearful, that their dreams, that are totally internal, subjective experiences, have some external reality, and that in fact they are in danger of being abducted by aliens. Because there are a number of people, you may not be claiming this, but of course a number of people who've had similar experiences
Are claiming
do believe that they have been abducted by aliens,
But there's a
extraterrestrials.
a fundamental difference between what's happening now and what happened in the past when somebody had this experience. In the past, when they had this experience, they were inevitably led, as I was, because you have no idea, and I suspect could never imagine how devastating the experience actually is.
I've talked to a couple of UFO abductees in this country.
I've talked to
I know you talked to
1,100, and I have letters in my database, computer database, from 4,000.
No, I have some idea of the sincerity and the depth of feeling that.
Well, I'm
some
glad
people
to
have
hear
about
that.
Sure.
In any case, I wanted to just finish what I was saying about what the Foundation is doing, because it's important and germane to this conversation. One of the things that it has done is it's been able to find some competent scientists who are willing to work, albeit incognito. Nobody so far has been willing to, for example, let their colleagues know that they're doing this. But some interesting studies have taken place, and here's one of them. It was found, and this study is still in progress, admittedly, that there is a group of physiological characteristics claimed by people who have had these experiences that's radically different from the characteristics claimed by people who have not, by the control group. And these are all quite measurable, quite easily measurable for that matter. And we can now begin to test these people medically to see if the characteristics that they claim are actually present in their bodies. They're not
physical, not psycho. Physical characteristics.
Physical
not psychological.
characteristics. Now, when I started this, I felt that the UFO community probably did not have the answer. I say probably did not, because the experience is too powerful and too devastating for me to say certainly did not. And I felt, however, that the answer would be found in the human body somewhere. I did not think that it would necessarily be found by psychological testing or the use of hypnosis or anything like that. But it's something that's happening to human beings, and therefore the body is where it is happening.
It's not that long
It's
ago
not
that we were all being
happening,
taken
actually.
in by...
It's happening.
I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. I must tell you that I personally am not sure because of the experiences I've had, but I still feel the first place to look is the body.
Well, it's less than 10 years since we saw in front of our very eyes spoons being bent. Indeed, very distinguished scientists from several British universities even attested to how this could not be done by any known force. Subsequently, it was shown that actually it was being done by sheer trickery. And the depressing thing for me about the sort of concatenation of claims of strange experiences dating back to spiritualism in the late 19th century with Crookes, distinguished scientist, etc. Arthur Conan Doyle was interested in that sort of thing, is actually how, if you contrast parascience or the paranormal and the progress that has been made in actually establishing these phenomena with the progress and the change that has been made with normal science, and normal science has progressed out of all perception compared to how it was 70, 80, 100 years ago. Yet in laboratories up and down the country today, people are still dealing out cards and trying to guess which patterns are on them. There has been actually zero progress in establishing the basic phenomena. And you know, it does seem to come in cycles. It was spiritualism in the 19th century, immediately after the Second World War, with the fears of the Cold War. Aliens and UFOs tended to be a surrogate for the men with the snow on their boots. In the 1960s, there was a certain sort of more hippie type belief in these things, in horoscopes and things like that. I just find it all really rather hard to take, because here we are 80 years, 100 years after Arthur Conan Doyle was sitting in seances asking the question, what is happening? You are sitting here saying, my book is asking the question, what is happening? Well, you know, it's just not good enough. It's time we actually got some answers.
I agree. Completely, and I think that we're probably...
Or else we stopped asking the question and said, well, you know, it's a silly question to ask.
All of science shares your attitude, I think, or almost all of science, which is why I don't think we'll ever get any answers. And yet, at the same time, in many respects, the experience that I had is indistinguishable from every conversion experience that I've ever read about, from St. Paul to Muhammad, and I hope I don't get put in trouble with somebody for saying this, right up to the Mormon chap,
Joseph Smith.
Joseph Smith. I mean, what is the difference?
Yeah.
But what is the difference? The difference is only that my particular culture caused me to present myself with this experience in the form of aliens. But the same net effect seems to be there. That is to say, a mysterious mechanism which seeks to exert control and to induce change.
Oh, this is really not acceptable
in
either.
The individual. Of course it is. It's perfectly
the
acceptable.
religious conversion of down the edges is part of fits rather well into a well thought out, developed theological background. There is a long and distinguished religious tradition and inherited culture almost. But I'm
not sort of a tramp with my ugly post-industrial gods then.
What troubles me more is not that people like he come up with these ideas, but there's so many believers in it. So many people get caught up in it.
But are you saying it is an internal subjective experience and not an external?
I don't know.
He doesn't know. The main trouble is, did you experience this in the, like a vision, or, since you're a very good professional writer, did you invent it based upon your knowledge of the UFO law? If you did genuinely experience this in the manner of a religious vision or conversion, it's difficult to know what book you could have written next, because you would have been writing irrelevantly to the most important thing that was happening to you. On the other hand,
exactly.
If you did make it up...
exactly the situation I was in.
If you did very cleverly make it up, then you would be being irresponsible in that sense.
Well, I don't know. It seems to take an almost spectacular insensitivity to accuse me of having made it up, as you have not done, indeed. But because the hell of the situation I'm in, I was, after all, once a valid member of my own community, and I am not now. I have had the experience of being physically spat upon by people who were outraged at what they believed, or an individual, I should say. It's only happened once. And I was stupid enough to think it was a leak coming out of the ceiling. I didn't realize anyone would actually do that to you in this age. But because of the fact that they felt I was fostering superstition.
Were they speaking from a born-again Christian standpoint, or from the point of view of
a
a skeptic?
I didn't catch the individual, as I said. But at that time, I realized what had happened to me. The man was already long gone, and I could not, unfortunately, stop him. And what I wish I could have done and said, "Oh, excuse me, I don't really mind this, but I'm so curious to know why you did it."
Yeah.
But you have, in your, again in the same book, admitted to untruths in the past about other incidents, fantasies, untruths. You, for a number of years, apparently told a story about being present on the University of Texas campus when a sniper killed a couple of girls. You, in your book, In Communion, you said that was no longer true.
Now, would I have said something like that in the book if I had been trying to create a convincing picture of myself?
No, it's a bit paradoxical, because you may well be telling the truth, but I mean, you have already admitted that on other occasions, for dramatic effect or for what other reasons, you have told interesting stories about being an eyewitness to a murder by a sniper of two girls on a campus.
In fact, there. What had happened
and you now say that your account of it was not true.
No, you didn't read the next book, Transformation.
Well, you said it was true again. In the next
It is true, and what happened after I wrote Communion was that people were telling me about things like screen memories, that a traumatic experience can be covered by a less traumatic memory. It's a commonplace. Yeah. And I suppose, to escape from the actual and very horrible memories of the Whitman incident at the University of Texas, had all but convinced myself that that had been a screen memory, because when I asked the people whom I remembered seeing at the campus whether or not they remembered me being there, they all said no, they did not remember me being there. However, I later found somebody who had a fairly clear memory of me being there, and what bothered me was after I wrote Communion, that particular memory seemed so vivid, I couldn't convince myself that it was a screen memory, and finally I found out actually what my motive for having been at the campus was.
This is the trouble with screen memories, though.
But let's clarify the position first. First of all, you were there, then you were not there.
No, you were there.
I was there.
Yes.
After I wrote Communion,
you were interviewed.
My faith in my own perceptions was sufficiently shaken for me to question whether or not these enormous events in my past were really what they seemed, and that was one of the ones I questioned. It's as simple as that.
And you said at that time that you hadn't been.
The form of your questioning was to say you were not there. Now you're
correct.
saying you were there. Is that
I know
correct?
I was.
You were there.
But that could be a screen memory. So, I mean, in
No,
the next
it's not.
book,
No, it's
you
not.
could shift the goalpost. It becomes a little like Carlos Castaneda then, because in the Don Juan books, you tend to get an entirely different perspective in each successive revelation of the truth, which I think is a thing that bothers people. Because if you do contradict yourself in a book, then you can provide a perfectly plausible explanation in the next book for the reason why you contradicted yourself.
Why would I have contradicted myself if I wasn't trying to be honest? That's what interests me with this type of line of questioning when it comes up, that it's perfectly obvious what I should have done had I been making a hoax is simply left the whole thing out. But instead of leaving it out, I put it in, and I put it in precisely because I wanted people to see the way in which this could derange one's memory of one's whole life experience. Because once you have had something happen to you this vivid and this extraordinarily improbable and this impossible to prove, you are left without moorings in your own memory, and it's a dreadful situation to be in. And it took me quite a number of years, 3 or 4 years, to come back to a sense of perspective, and I did it primarily by sifting through my past very finely and finding out what was real and what wasn't.
You can see the difficulty for the reader. I mean, in a sense, you're trying to demonstrate your integrity and honesty by saying in Communion that in the past you've been dishonest.
If I was trying to demonstrate my integrity and honesty, if that had even been an issue, I would never have written the book, obviously. I wasn't interested in it. I'm willing to take the heat on that basis. What I was interested in was demonstrating the experience as accurately as I possibly could.
I see no, I feel that this is given them an importance and prominence. Let us, for argument's sake, say that I could now demonstrate to you by taking a little hypodermic syringe out of my pocket and inserting it into your arm and giving you a shot or something, that you could relive some of these things, or rather similar things could happen to you. You could be describing a perfectly real experience of yours, but the significance would merely be that it happened to be the appropriate neurons firing in your brain, and that was all there was to it.
But it's still valid experience.
Yes, but it may even be interesting for other people to read. Now, I don't think one has to draw in aliens or anything else. One merely has to draw in an imagination, which is triggered by
aliens. I simply described what I had seen.
But it's, what I find it quite difficult is the heat it is generating. If you had a dream or an experience which you had and you described it, and there were contradictions in it, or at least contradictions where you may also have described, it does not have to postulate, however, any activity outside yourself. And if there was a nasty cactus in your cabin, which for all I know had emanations which produced delusions, then that too would be part of the explanation. Now, why must it be anything other than that? And the fact is that there may be 100 or 1,000 other people who have similar things. There There are, after all, what is it, 2 billion people in the world, and statistics are that almost anything which one person experiences is replicated by somebody else sooner or later, in a way which is at least comparable. So I see nothing desperately strange in what you describe. You've simply been more eloquent and put it into print.
But
it was found to be a document which other people find interesting to read, and that's all there is to it.
I would agree with you, but what I don't understand, and have never understood clearly, is the vehemence with which it was greeted. I wasn't really aware of the existence of the issue of, I was aware of the existence of UFOs and the issue of UFOs by the time I published the book. But while I was writing it, I was peripherally aware of it. I had read the book by Randall's that you mentioned, and I had read in the past parts of other books, including the Condon Report, the preface of which I read when I was in college, and it said there was nothing in it, and that was kind of an end of it for me. But then I discovered that there was that everyone in the media knew all kinds of things, more than I did generally about it, because they'd had UFO experts on all the time, and that they would introduce me again and again and again as Whitley Strieber, the man who has been taken aboard a spaceship by aliens, and their ratings would go screaming up through the roof. And I found myself in the position of realizing that, in a sense, you're quite right, I had done something wrong by writing Communion, precisely because it was so convincing. In my attempt to elucidate the experience as accurately and as vividly as it had actually been for me, I inadvertently became an advocate for what I had intended to question.
So did the publisher put the face, because the face that is on the front of the paperback edition that was sold here was the kind of face that UFO abductees, people who claim to have been abducted by
aliens, which I found out after I had had the face. I sat down with the artist, and I had that face painted to my specific memories, then later found that this was the face that they all saw, but it's also the face in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and maybe that's where it came from. And then I found that the people in who did the face in Close Encounters said that they had interviewed UFO abductees to make their face.
So it wasn't an intention to imply to people that, I mean, a lot of people bought the book, I think, believing that what you were describing was some kind of alien visitation. I mean, I think a lot of people bought it thinking that you were describing something that you felt was an external reality.
Why is it a sin to speculate about that? What if it was? Why is it a sin to speculate about that? That fascinates me, that I would actually, I think even conceivably, by certain, not by you I would hope, but by certain skeptics, have been jailed for even suggesting this or opening the question. And that just is fascinating.
Let me ask Heinz Wolf and widen it out a little bit to say that what's wrong with speculating about that? Heinz, speculate. Is there indeed anyone out there?
Well, I mean, I think there are I think there's a statistical question, answer to the question, that you can, I think, with reasonable statistics certainly say that if certain physical conditions are required for life to start, and life doesn't necessarily have to be our kind of life, then the probabilities are that amongst all the planets and all the solar systems and so on, which there are, that there will very likely be 7 people sitting around in a television studio making a television program just like this one. I mean, the numbers are large enough for at least a school of thought to think this is so. So I would be perfectly prepared to concede that life is not as uncommon, it is not unique to the Earth. I would even be prepared to concede that it was not all that unlikely that intelligent life, perhaps roughly speaking at our level, might be around somewhere. I would find it quite difficult because certainly the physics which we all are accustomed to, that they are likely to be able to come in series. Now, the interesting thing is that all the experiments of detecting signals from outer space, which are less than random, have so far failed. And if you look at it the other way around, there's now a sphere of a radius of 80 light years, which is full of the light program and channel 4 and things of this kind, which other intelligent life could no doubt receive sooner or later and send messages back to us. So unless everybody is really rather behind us, or an awful long way away, which is much more likely.
Yes.
So I mean, I would, on judgment of anything I know or anything which physics can do at the moment, and perhaps you can correct me in this, is that yes, all right, there may be people out there, or maybe life out there, but the chance of actually meeting them is pretty remote, because it's simply too far away.
Yes.
Dr. Burdell, I mean...
Yes, I'd agree with that too. The universe is an enormous place. There's a rather nice multiplication table that dates from Arthur Stanley Eddington. In mathematical terms it says 10 to the power 11, but if we spell that out for the non-mathematical people with us, that's, if I can get it right at this time of night, 100,000 million stars equals one galaxy, and 100,000 million galaxies equals one universe. So that's an awful lot of stars around. And the argument goes on, our sun is a very, very typical star, nothing special about it. So there must be lots of stars like that. Okay, not all the stars will have planets, but some of them very probably will. Okay, not all the planets are going to be habitable, but maybe some of them will. And you make guesses, pretty wild guesses, about how you're knocking down this enormous number. And then you come to the question that I find very hard to answer, and that is, what are the odds of life evolving on this planet that has a suitable atmosphere and so on, at an appropriate distance from a suitable star? But I mean, even if you put in wild factors like 1 in a million or something like that, you still come up with 1,000 million possible sites in the universe. It's big.
Well,
a thousand million, just let me say one more thing. 1,000 million sites in our universe actually means on average less than one per galaxy. So we don't have another one on average in our galaxy. That's within 10,000 light years.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it, that there could be so much intelligent life and that all of it could be in effect alone because of the enormity of the universe. I must say, though, if somebody has come here out of all of those multitudes, we've had some extremely bad luck. We could have had a more congenial group, I think. But there's another principle, though, that hasn't been brought up. You're familiar, I think it's called the anthropic cosmological principle, another way of looking at the statistics that suggests quite seriously and quite effectively that we may be entirely alone. And in part, one of the things that worries me most about the spreading belief in aliens, which I hope I have not been as responsible for as you believe, is that if we are entirely alone, then there is a great tragedy in the making here, I think. And even if we are alone in our own galaxy, we must be living here in our isolation and growing as we have. There must be something quite fine and rare about us. And we're beginning to look outward, as I pointed out in Communion, in some particularly frightening ways. And one worries that as the stars go out, the atmosphere becomes thicker and thicker and more polluted. People will begin to seek for help that isn't necessarily there.